What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. Mtg. We like to have magic, all that stuff by now. And if you ask me, little setup for you there. I guess it's feasible that you might ask me this. The coolest thing in Ixalan block wasn't the dinosaurs, which is probably an unpopular opinion. It definitely wasn't like the weird merfolk things that walk around on land. That was an odd thing to do. Now, it was probably, again, in my opinion, the Vampire Legion. I freaking love Vampire Legion so much. This weird, like, conquistadorian, if that's a word, conquistadorish / Spanish Inquisition mashup. It's a really, really cool idea, and the execution was dope in the lore, too. And maybe the coolest part of the coolest faction in Ixalan block was Alinda the Dusk Rose, a card that I still miss very much in Standard to this day. But thanks to M21, we got to take a little visit, pop in on the Vampire Legion, see what they're doing, and we learned, just as Bret Michaels in Poison tried to tell us so many years ago, that every rose has its thorn. That's right, everybody. Today it's Uncle Vito. We're doing a deck tech over here already. And you already knew that. I'm not surprising you in any way. You saw the title in the thumbnail and all that stuff. But I just can't help but be excited about this card. It was my #1 sleeper in the set for a reason. And over the last week now, I've tried to make it work in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, let's hear some raps. Let's do some raps.
Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
And we're back. And to answer the question I get in the comments section every single time I do a deck tech, yes, that is me doing the mad rhyming in the intro. Where can you hear the whole song? You just did, Jack. That's the song in its entirety. But anyway, let's talk about Vito. I have not personally tried this hard to make a card work since, I don't know, like Chamber Sentry. And we all know how that worked out. I'm sorry, Chamber Sentry. You're my buddy still. But, sad violin music.wave playing over this part. I miss you. I could still play Chamber Sentry if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. I got to face facts. It's a bad card, but Vito, not a bad Magic card. And I know that because I've thrown a lot of dung at the wall over the last week to see what actually sticks in terms of making a good Vito deck. And I've been on quite the journey. I started with a Vito Aristocrats thing, and I really did not like this deck. It felt like an Aristocrats deck, a Priest of Forgotten Gods deck, a Bolas's Citadel deck. I just happened to play Vito as a 3-drop, and honestly, it's got like 3 other 3-drops it would rather play than Vito. It just did not feel like the right shell for the deck. So I moved on to kind of an Abzan Vito list. I wanted to try green in the deck. I had high hopes for ramping into Bolas's Citadel. I had high hopes for Gilded Goose plus Vito, make food every turn, sacrifice it, deal damage. If nothing else, you can win that way. The deck wins occasionally, but it still feels a step off, and it's a little bit too all in on the combo. So I decided to go with the more sort of control-ish Vito deck that played sweepers in the main deck and a couple of other removal pieces, but it's still too all in on the combo, and if your opponent shuts down your Vito, there just really wasn't too much you could do. Now, in the end, after all that experimentation and many other decks that were basic, slight permutations of the 3 decks I've already discussed, a process I like to call Vitosis. Don't ever let anyone tell you this isn't a smart channel. I've decided that the best place to go with this deck was just to ramp up the life gain payoffs to a much higher level and play more threats than just Vito in the deck. And since we've done that, the deck has started actually winning games. Crazy, right? But if I'm going to bring you a deck, I want it to actually be a decent, acceptable deck that you can ladder with. So let's show it to you finally after a ridiculously long intro. That took a while, didn't it? Anyway, let's talk about this deck, actually. Starting with Mr. V himself. You've already read the card a bunch of times. He's been on screen like the entire video. And you probably already knew what he did before that. It likely influenced your click in the first place. But yeah, Vito, you want to play all 4 copies of this, the entire play set, even though it's legendary, because you want it on turn 3 in most games so you can set up a decent turn 4. You want to see it as early as possible, and in some cases, you want to see it as often as possible. Vito has a huge target on his back. He's a marked man, and there's plenty of ways for your opponent to take it out. So often seeing multiple copies of Vito in a game is exactly what you want. But honestly, Vito's not the card I'm going to end up talking most about. If I was doing an Exquisite Blood deck tech, I would show Exquisite Blood first, but I would be like, hey, this is what this card does. Let's move on to how we synergize with it, which is exactly what we're going to do with a 3-mana Exquisite Blood. So let's talk about all the ways that you can break Vito. First of all, if you want to meme, you're in the right place. You're on the right channel because I will always give you the opportunity to do so. We're playing 3 copies of Revival Revenge here. Both halves of this synergize super well with Vito. I've already said Vito has this huge target on his back, and he probably will die at some point in the game, so it's not unheard of to use the Revival half of Revival Revenge to get Vito back. Put yourself in a position where you can start doing cool stuff. But if you've already got a Vito on the table and you're at 6 mana, which is actually harder than it sounds, just letting you know, you can just play the revenge half of this. Your opponent's going to lose half their life, your life total is going to double, and yes, that does count as gaining life, to answer your question, curious commenter. You're probably going to kill them unless you're at a very, very low life total. So that satisfies your craving for a one-turn kill right there. I know you folks, I get what you want, but this card has a lot more utility than that. Not only can it get a Vito back from the grave, but there are multiple very important creatures this can get back from the graveyard in this deck. And even if you don't have a Vito out, sometimes you'll just play the revenge half of this to stay alive for a turn or two and give yourself a chance to draw into that Vito. Like I said, kind of back there towards the beginning now, one of the things that improved this deck the most was simply adding more life game payoffs to it, which sounds like a no-brainer, I understand, but a lot of the preliminary builds I was working with were all basically Bolas's Citadel decks. You need as many cards that gain life as possible in those builds, so you can effectively go off and get a combo kill if you have a Vito in play. Now, since we've taken Bolas's Citadel out, that affords us many more slots, much more room to actually play real life game payoffs, and that has worked out immensely better. This way, we actually have other ways to win the game if we can't assemble Vito plus Revival Revenge. This constitutes more threats and, again, more dimension to the deck, so this was the much better way to play. We've got 3 copies of Griffin Airy, as well as 3 copies of Indulging Patricia, and 4 copies of maybe the best card in the deck, depending on the matchup, Speaker of the Heavens. Confession here, full disclosure, I really didn't have much faith in Speaker of the Heavens when I first started working with this build, but it has impressed me and overperformed in a bunch of different matchups. If your opponent doesn't have decent removal for it, it can get out of hand pretty quickly, especially if you're playing against a deck that doesn't have a whole lot of aggro. And there's a fair amount of decks like that in the format right now, especially decks like Team of Reclamation and the various control builds that you might find yourself playing against. Speaker of the Heavens will very often start proccing in those matchups, and it is very nice to have a creature factory that makes 4/4 flyers and does so very consistently in these slower matchups. In aggro matchups, it's not quite as good against decks like Mono Red, but it can still block with a little bit of lifelink for you. You can bring it back with the Revival half of Revival Revenge. That can be really nice. And hey, if your opponent does use a removal spell on Speaker, that's a removal spell they don't have for Vito. Now, Griffin Airy may not have impressed me as much as Speaker did, but if you remember my review of this card during spoiler season, I was not excited or impressed by Griffin Airy whatsoever, but I have really come around on this card. It has been key to certain matchups, making evasive threats once a turn that can fly in, damage the opponent, or just block and keep you alive until you can assemble a more combo-y kill, are both really important facets of this card. Now, I hate to report this, but sadly, Indulging Patrician really didn't live up to the hopes I had for this card, and it's probably the one that disappointed me the most out of these 3, but it's still a really important card in aggro matchups, not only mono red, where it's incredibly important, but mono white life gain as well, which I've been running into a lot on Arena lately. This eats up Healer's Hawks and Fairy Guide Mothers and Loyal Pegasus and all other kinds of flying attackers in that deck. But even if it doesn't kill the thing that it's blocking, and very often it won't, it will still often stay alive, gain you a life, absorb that damage, and if you have a Vito on the table, it'll often deal at least 6, if not 8 damage per turn cycle, because you'll also be getting in with combat damage with it. If you don't have a Vito out, it's still probably proccing 4 damage a turn for you, if you can gain life in other ways. And that's nothing to sneeze at either. In terms of actually closing the game out, that was one of the biggest problems the deck had when it was just a Vito combo deck. Adding Indulging Patrician really gives us some closeout power that we didn't previously have. But hey, those last 3 cards didn't even gain life. What kind of a life gain deck is this, Dev? Don't worry, there's stuff. There's stuff that gains life. Let's talk about it. First of all, we're playing 4 copies of Revitalize. Glad to be able to play this card again, but there's also 4 copies of Charming Prince and 4 copies of Oath of Kaya, just to get started. Now, Revitalize doesn't look particularly strong in any deck that it's ever in, but it is vital to this deck's function. On turn 2, this can be a great play, especially if we got set up with a turn 1 Speaker of the Heavens. Hey, that can be very nice, but this also just draws us deeper into the deck. In some ways, we are a combo deck. Even if we're not looking for a Vito or a Revival Revenge at that moment, we're probably looking for a Griffinary or a Speaker of the Heavens or an Indulgent Patrician. There's just so many different cards this deck needs at any given time that being able to draw a little bit deeper into the deck is always very, very important. And the ability to play this at instant speed can be nice on occasion as well. As far as Charming Prince, it's nice to get a body that gives us 3 life, because this can be a great blocker, and if you need to, it can swing in from time to time too and really benefit from the fact that Vito can give your bodies lifelink. That can also be a good thing to remember, but mostly Charming Prince is going to come in to gain us life once we already have important life gain payoffs down. Obviously, this procs Griffinary or Indulging Patrician the turn that it comes down, but on turn 2, this can also gain 3 life to get us a little bit closer to 27 life for Speaker of the Heavens. But you won't always gain life when it comes into play. There's other stuff you can do with this. Sometimes on turn 2, if you didn't get turn 1 Speaker, you'll just scry to get to that Vito a little bit sooner, or whatever card you might be looking for at the time. So maybe you're looking for lands. Charming Prince can help you scry into those a little bit easier. There's just a lot that this card does to smooth out the deck, but you'd play it regardless because it gains you 3 life when it ETBs most times. And Oath of Kaya is a removal piece that we absolutely have to have in this deck. It does everything that we want. The deck is a little bit light on removal, at least in Game 1, and Oath of Kaya is one of the best pieces that we actually have access to, again, in the main deck at least. But being able to proc all of these various life gain things like Griffinary and Indulging Patrician and whatnot is just one aspect of this card, but we really need to get stuff off the other side of the table in many, many games, and Oath of Kaya is very good at doing that. It can also just go face if you have a Vito out and suddenly deal 6 damage, which has closed out a bunch of games for me. It's also a great draw, by the way, if you have a Vito and a Patrician out, because this will end up effectively dealing 9 damage off of top decking it, and that can also close a lot of games out too. Oath of Kaya is a very flexible piece in this deck. But we're not done gaining life. We're not even close, y'all. We've got plenty of other stuff that does that, like Fate's Fetters, which looks like a really weird include, and I 100% understand that. But let me explain myself. Now, the biggest reason that Fetters made it into the deck might surprise you. It's not just the 4 life, which is a big deal. We'll get to that in a second. But it's actually just as simple as I needed more 4-drops and fewer 3-drops. That's it. Simple. I was originally playing Murderous Rider in this deck, but we already have a bunch of 3-drops, and I don't want to hold up mana on turn 3 to play this at instant speed. I'd rather just spend my 3 mana on my turn playing Vito, get our plan going. You almost never want to hold up 3 mana on turn 3, so Murderous Rider didn't feel good. I know that the creature half of it has lifelink, but that did not often make up for the fact that when you cast it in the early or mid game, you lose that 2 life, and that can often take you off of your Speaker of the Heavens plan. There's just kind of a lot of issues with Murderous Rider, so I decided we'll stick to playing Vito on 3, and we'll just follow up on the next turn with Fate's Fetters and deal 4 to our opponent and take out their Nissa. Seems good to me. We just don't have access to a whole lot of good ways of taking out Planeswalkers, and even though this doesn't remove the Planeswalker entirely, it effectively does for the time being, which can be a huge deal against, your Nissas and your Teferis and whatnot. So, huge fan of this. It also obviously takes out problem creatures, at least for the time being, while it's wearing the fetters. It doesn't take the creature or the Planeswalker out of play like a Banishing Light would or anything, but it still shuts down 90% of the things people are trying to do with their broken creatures and Planeswalkers, all while proccing Griffinary and Indulging Patrician and doing 4 damage off of Vito. It's just actually a really good card. It feels like playing Fate's Fetters 10 years ago when it was actually decent. It turns out it still can be. But the other 4-drop I invested in was Sorin. And I kind of came to a crossroads here because it's either play Ajani or play Sorin. You could play both if you wanted to, but then you have to take out Fate's Fetters. And honestly, I think you want removal more than you want to play 2 different Planeswalkers in the 4-drop slot. Just by experience, I think Fate's Fetters is the much better card than Ajani. I went with Sorin here for a few reasons. First of all, the creatures have lifelink during your turn isn't that impactful on most turns in this deck because a lot of our creatures already have lifelink. But if you have a board full of Griffinary tokens, that can be very important. So that can come up every now and again. Best thing about this card is being able to get a Speaker of the Heavens back for just 1 loyalty, or a Vito back for 3 loyalty. Ditto Indulging Patrician, you get that back for 3 loyalty. This deck has a lot of different moving parts that it has to set up on the board to like really be successful. So along with, you know, a redundant card like the Revival half of Revival Revenge, Sorin can really help you keep your board state established through a storm of removal, and that is really, really important. Plus the card does damage by itself. It can ping Planeswalkers if you needed to. You know, Vito effectively doubles the damage from it. There's just nothing bad about Sorin in this deck. But before we get to the spiciest card in the deck to finish off the main here, let's just talk about Erebos' Intervention for a second. I'm just playing a Silver Bullet Intervention, but I really want to play more copies of this card. I'm just not sure what to take out. This does 2 important things. First of all, it's removal. That's good. Obviously gains you life, so, you know, Vito will deal extra damage off of it. You can proc Indulging Patrician and Griffin Airy and all that. Being able to remove an opponent's creature on your turn. It's got to be on your turn to proc Griffin Airy. But being able to, you know, remove an opponent's creature and get a 2/2 Griffin off of this card while also gaining some life, it's all really, really nice. But there are also, you know, very late game cases where you're able to Erebos' Intervention their guy for like 7, gain 7 life, and hit them for 7 damage. And even if you didn't finish the game off, you came really close. So sometimes this card can just equate to Fireball if you've got a Vito out and they have a single creature. So it's really, card is really, really hot in a lot of situations. And if you really needed to, you know, you can use it to get an Euro out of your opponent's graveyard. And that could be important too. So there's a lot of play on this card, and I'd like to up the copies. But the final card in the deck is a card that I was trying out just for experimental purposes. I didn't think that it would actually work out. I just wanted to try it. But actually, Clackbridge Troll is like super stupid in this deck. It's so good in this deck. It was already tough to pay the Troll Toll for a lot of opponents because you being able to gain 3 and draw a card is pretty good. But when your opponent pays the Troll Toll against this deck, not only do you gain the life and draw the card, but you get a Griffin and you deal 3 extra damage to them from Patrician or Vito or both or whatever. It's so crazy if you have the right board set up. But even if Clackbridge comes down on an empty board, that can be nice some of the time too, because gaining life and drawing cards is what this deck needs to do. We really needed another card draw outlet besides just like Castle Locthwain, because Castle Locthwain costs us life. We don't necessarily want that. But, you know, we just needed more ways to draw cards that were actually effective in this deck. We'll get to Dawn of Hope in a little bit. We'll talk about that. But, like I said, I wanted card draw that was actually effective. And Dawn of Hope costs way too much mana. We'll talk about it. But anyway, Clackbridge Troll often will draw you that card and gain you that 3 life the turn that it comes down. And that doesn't feel so bad when you're getting a bunch of other procs off of it. And eventually, if it can get through for damage, you can end the game this way too. One thing I said the deck needed earlier was a higher density of threats to actually close the game out. This is card draw, extra, you know, 3 life procs for your 2 cards that want that, extra damage off of Vito, and a big game-ending threat, all in the same card. And honestly, you're trying to get to 6 mana to cast Revenge in a lot of games anyway, so why not bridge the gap by playing a 5-drop? I'm telling you, Clackbridge Troll is very, very good in this deck. Try it out. Now let's look at the lands, and it's actually fairly simple here. I wanted to keep the mana base as budget as I possibly could, and that's not hard because we get to play Scoured Barrens instead of, say, Temple, which isn't a huge price difference, but it, you know, every dollar counts. So Scoured Barrens cost 15 cents, Temple of Silence cost 75. You do the maths. It's you're really only saving like 250 there, but still, every drop counts. So I feel like we have to play 4 copies of Godless Shrine, even though there are setups I don't like. If you have to cast, say, Speaker of the Heavens on turn 1 off of a Godless Shrine, you now have to gain 9 life to start proccing Speaker. That doesn't feel good, but you still have to play Godless Shrine in the deck, whether you like it or not. It's just the best untapped dual land the only untapped dual land that we have in Standard right now. Castle Locthwain can also feel bad because you don't want to go under 27 life if you're at 27 life. But at the same time, we need cards in this deck that draw cards, get us deeper into the deck, and help us assemble combos. So Castle Locthwain is a must-play, again, kind of whether we like it or not. Aside from that, 7 plains, 6 swamps. You could judge this up with a Temple or 2 if you wanted to, but I don't really want to play more tap lands than we're already playing. And I guess you could play Fabled Passage if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. But here's the sideboard, and this is a relatively simple affair too, but there is some spice in here. That said, I'm going to start with the least spicy card, which is Noxious Grasp. This is already an amazing sideboard card for pretty much any deck carrying black, but hey, it gains us life, so it's even better in this deck. Aside from that, I'm playing a 1-of Indulging Patrician to fill out the 4-of against aggro decks and whatnot. There's also 2 copies of the 3-mana Kaya in here. This will also take out random 1-drops, which is kind of important, but for the most part, it's going to gain us life against decks that want to use their graveyard like Euro. Keep that in mind. Basilica Bellhaunt. The Fresh Prince of Bellhaunt returns. I actually really wanted this to be in the main deck, but I think Sorin and even Fate's Fetters are better card than Bellhaunt. Aside from that, Kaya's Wrath will come in against the aggro matchups. You will be more than happy to cast a Kaya's Wrath in order to not die. And hey, you may gain a little bit of life off of it. If you have 3 creatures out, then yeah, you'll gain 3 life, proc your Griffinary, and you'll be back on board before your opponent. Not bad. But anyway, Heliod's Intervention. The last card in the sideboard right here, for obvious reasons. This busts up ovens and wilderness reclamations and all kinds of stuff, while also having a mode that just allows you to shotgun your opponent out of the game by gaining twice X life with a veto in play. But here are your power rankings right here. Final score of Nintendo 64, which is actually a pretty good score when you consider that we just did an Ugin deck. I got a 65. Like 1 point less. And that deck costs like $600? That's a ridiculous amount of money. This deck, actually just under $100 if you don't count the basic lands and stuff. And you shouldn't, they just give them away. But for that price, you get a deck that's not only fun, but I have banged my head against the wall 100 times to make sure is at least somewhat competitive. Very often, the hallmark of a good Magic deck in just about any format is its ability to generate value quickly. And when I first looked at the components of this deck, I didn't think it was generating value quickly or impactfully enough. Right? You know, oh, you have to skip your turn 2 for Griffinary, and even if you do proc it, it just gets you a 2/2. Doesn't seem fast enough or impactful enough. But through testing, I think I've proven myself wrong here. You know, it does require some moving parts to all come together and be on the board at the same time, but we're resilient enough to make sure that happens. We have enough removal and life gain to make sure that we stay in the game long enough to actually put important pieces together. There's just, again, a lot of moving parts, but I was surprised by how well the synergy came together, and most importantly, how quickly this deck can actually generate value. A lot faster than I initially anticipated. And all that is to say that I had a lot of fun with this deck, both building it and playing with it, experimenting with different things. And yeah, I did do a lot of banging my head against the wall at first, trying to make a deck that actually worked the way I wanted it to. But once we arrived at this final build, I ended up having a freaking blast with this deck. You know, sometimes this feels like a job. And it literally, I mean, it is a job. I make money doing this, and I don't make money any other way, so I would be on the street if I didn't do this. I mean, it literally is a job, but sometimes it feels like a job, depending on what decks I'm covering, and it's not every deck that I build that I'll end up playing for the entire season, right? In this case, I'm probably going to keep playing this deck pretty much the whole season, because that's how much fun I had with it, and that's how competitive it can be at times. So I hope you get a chance to try this thing out, craft up some cards, or order them through that deck list link in the description down there to my dudes at TCG Player. Order through that deck list to help me out. But, you know, all I'm saying is I want you to try this thing out, even if you have to crack out the Sharpie and some basic lands and proxy it up. Give this deck a try. I did not expect this deck to be as good. I was excited about playing with Vito, and I think I made that much clear while reviewing the cards and the sleeper video and all that. I was excited about Vito, but I didn't expect it to be decent. Turns out the card is much better than even I expected, and I'm the one that made it my #1 sleeper. So I want you to try this deck out. It's got so much going for it. Even if you never see a Vito, there's all kinds of cool stuff it can do. So give this thing a shot. Relatively cheap to do so. And if you wanted to do that, then check out the link in the description to TCG Player. It's the first link down there. If you order the deck through that link, you'll be helping me out monetarily, while also getting yourself some cards. I mean, you're going to order the deck anyway. You might as well do it through the link. But anyway, aside from that, you can also like the video, subscribe to the channel for more of this, and also other things. I do other stuff. More of this and other things. Make sure you hit the bell for the notifications. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. I always forget to say that part. Or join the Patreon. Just $1 a month will let you vote on what you even want to see around here in the first place. That's not bad for $1 a month. That's a pretty good deal. So do that, and I guess I'm done. I feel like I've talked about this deck for a really long time. What is a 45-minute deck tech right now? Feels like it, so I should probably get out of here. But just let me know how you felt about it, how you'd build it down there in the comments section, because I think I've illustrated there's a buttload of ways to build a deck. Try out that Abzan build, by the way. It's not bad. But in any case, That's all I got for this one. Just let me know how you felt about it down there, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love, and be kind.